Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this wrap-up session, which, as we did yesterday, we're going to try and get a snapshot of what you've been discussing in your panels this morning and add that to what we heard last night about the discussions in yesterday's panels, as we continue to try to fulfill that task that ETUI Research Director Nicola Kontouris set for us at the start of the conference, namely to imagine and define a more equal society. For those who weren't with us yesterday, let me just introduce myself. My name is Jackie Davis, and I'm acting as a sort of theme weaver throughout the 3 days of this conference, as we try to build this picture of what that equal society would look like, looking at this from a wide variety of perspectives. Try to identify those building blocks for a more equal society and the policies, instruments, processes, and actors required to realize that vision, and thus to begin developing the blueprint for equality that the title of this conference refers to, and really identify what needs to be done to turn that into a reality, to move from something that may look beautiful on paper, but delivers action on the ground. So we're going to look again at some of these many different aspects of what we've already heard is a very complex, multidimensional challenge, and address that great paradox that Nicola was talking about yesterday, that we have that consensus on growing inequalities and their threat to our social, economic, and human development, but we haven't had enough collective reflection on what actions need to be taken. So in this wrap-up session, I hope we're going to hear answers to what answers our speakers came up with to these three central questions. What should a more equal society look like? Based on the outcome of yesterday's discussions, it's clear this question is much easier to answer in some areas, such as gender equality in unpaid work or unequal protection against occupational risks, than it is in others, such as wage inequality. Second question, what policies, institutions, and actors are required to play a part in delivering it? And thirdly, and who needs to do what in order to deliver that substantive and transformative equality Nicola talked about and make our societies fairer, more resilient, and sustainable? Here, the clearest messages to emerge so far from yesterday's discussion, alongside some of the specific measures that we heard about, is the importance of putting this issue front and center in the political debate, and the challenges of doing so at a time when the influence of trade unions on the political discourse has declined, the need to give workers a much greater voice on all these issues, and meeting the challenges of doing this in areas of the economy like online gig working, so-called platform economy, and strengthening their bargaining position, and of course, the central role of trade unions in all of this. Their role now, their potential role, which we'll discuss in more detail in the final panel tomorrow. So let's build on that picture that we began to paint yesterday by hearing about your conversations this morning. Again, I'll introduce our rapporteurs as we go along, and let's try to see where we get to. At the end of this, I'm going to have a chat with Nicola Kontouris about the link between what you've been talking about in this research conference and the public part of the conference that starts this afternoon. So let me start with Sotiria Theodoropoulou, who is a senior researcher and head of unit for European economy, employment and social policies at the ETUI. And Sotiria, you were in the panel, the ECB's policies and inequality, impacts, trade-offs, and the question of democratic accountability. So my question really to you here is, you started out trying to answer the question, are the ECB's policies having an impact on inequality? And if so, what aspects? And I'm wondering what the answer to that was and what implications does this have for our definition of a more equal society? Sotiria.
Yes.
Your mic is not on. Try again.
Is it on now? Better? Yeah.
I can't hear you very well, but it may just be me. Yeah, that's better.
Now? Yeah, that's
better.
Much
better.
Yes, there appeared to be a consensus from the discussion in our panel that the ECB's policies, especially of the last few years from the global financial crisis onwards, have had at least some unintended impacts on inequality, especially wealth inequality. as the ECB, in order to preserve financial stability and try to restore inflation to its target rate at 2%, given that it was persistently lower than that, has been engaging in very large scale asset purchases, buying government and corporate bonds, which have been leading to asset prices, which of course benefit more those people who own these assets, the asset owners. And given that the people who have assets, from houses to financial assets, also tend to be the people on the middle and upper sort of ranks of the income and wealth distribution, then the gains for them from these asset purchases tended to be bigger than for those at the lower end of the income and wealth distribution. On the other hand, these policies, the ECB has claimed, have been having a positive impact on income inequality, a mitigating impact, I should put it more correctly, as they have been stimulating economic activity and therefore job creation, which in general, as a general rule, tends to favor more those people and households at the lower end of income distribution. There were some doubts expressed by the panelists on whether, or rather on the extent to which this has still been the case, given that we have seen that job creation has also been precarious job creation, with wages that have not always been the best that one could get. We had very weak wage recovery, for example, from 2015 onwards in Europe. So there was some questioning on whether this positive countervailing effect to the exacerbating effect of wealth inequality, whether on balance we could say that the ECB policies had a benign effect on income and wealth inequality taken together.
I think you also talked about, given these trade-offs, and that debate you were having about those relative impacts, you also talked about the legitimacy of the ECB to make those sorts of decisions on the trade-offs, the question of accountability. Did you come to any clear conclusions there about how effective that accountability is?
Yes, we discussed that, and as it was mentioned, these concerns about inequality, exacerbating inequality, as well as supporting the climate change, the green transition ambitions of the EU and full employment, are currently considered to be secondary objectives for the European Central Bank, which means, first of all, if push comes to shove, like we see now, for example, maintaining price stability, keeping inflation low and stable, in principle, should be taking precedence to these objectives. And there was a question of if the ECB is actually pursuing these secondary objectives at the same time, because we discussed that there are reasons, for example, for which inequality we don't only have normative reasons for the ECB to be trying to address it, but also reasons having to do with the efficacy of its policy.
Absolutely.
So the way it chooses to pursue these secondary objectives is not necessarily something that should be taken just by unelected technocrats who have been made deliberately politically.
Absolutely. So did your panel come up with some recommendations for how to address these issues, solutions to that?
Of legitimacy of inequality?
Yes, yeah, both.
Well, in terms of legitimacy, the first best solution would be to have a treaty change, which would change the mandate of the ECB. But given that this may not look particularly realistic to have right now, as alternatives, we discussed, or it was mentioned rather, that there should either be more coordination, more communication across different policy spheres. Because also an insight that emerged was that monetary policy is not necessarily the best tool for tackling inequality, given that it's quite a blunt one. So it should be supported by other policies such as fiscal policy, regulation. So having more, extended conversation, coordination across this policymakers across these policy spheres could be one way forward. Another way forward would be that there is more discussion between the ECB and the European Parliament in explaining the ways in which it will be tackling this secondary objective, so that there is some guidance,
some democratic accountability introduced. Yeah. And in terms, was there a lot of discussion of the levers that the ECB itself can use in this area to tackle inequalities, or was your focus more on the legitimacy accountability question?
We discussed that. And for the shorter term, what emerged was that perhaps the best thing that the ECB should do right now is to make sure that it avoids another financial crisis. We have seen in the last few weeks that interest rates at which countries like Italy and Greece can borrow compared to those of Germany, which is considered to be a very safe country, very unlikely to default on its public debt, have been rising. And this is exactly what happened started happening in 2009, 2010, and led to the Eurozone crisis. So a repetition of such a crisis would have quite detrimental effects for not just for the financial markets, but also for the real economy, which would hit the people at most precarious positions in the labor market and at the lower ends of the income distribution the worse.
So for you, Sotiria, was there one clear priority that emerged from all of this, whether it be in relation to the tackling of inequalities themselves or this accountability? Did something strike you as this is the key next step we need to take?
We did touch upon the question of how climate change can have an impact on inflation, which could exacerbate again inequalities in the way that we see right now, with energy prices increasing and hitting more the poorer households. So we could have a similar effect as we go forward with climate change, both because catastrophic weather events could increase food prices, or because the price of fossil fuels increase, or even because the additional demand for greener technologies might run into bottlenecks for the materials that are used to produce them. So one thing that the ECB could do there is to, together with other policies at the EU level, fiscal and the EU taxonomy, would be to facilitate investment in these greener technologies, so that their prices become, we avoid this inflationary effect, and they can be adopted faster and more widely.
Thank you very much indeed, Sotiria. Let us move on now to panel 12, minimum income schemes and the rise in inequality. And welcome back. She did this task yesterday. She's doing it again today, to Bianca Luna Fabris, Research and Communications Officer. Bianca, welcome back. Thank you for doing double duty here. In terms of the vision, the definition of a more equal society, did you come up with a clear goal, with a clear definition of what it is we're trying to do?
Yes, I think that's a very, very easy answer for the panel that I moderated today. So there are 1 in 5 individuals in the European Union are at risk of poverty and social exclusion. So an equal society is a society that doesn't have poverty. So I think this is a very immediate and simple answer to your question.
And then in terms of the levers, what we need to do, were there some clear instruments, policies, processes that we need to pursue? And we'll come to the who needs to do what, the actors. I'm always reminded of Nicola's phrase about action needs actors. Come back to that in a minute. But in terms of the levers, what was identified in terms of how effectively these minimum income schemes are working, how they fit into broader social protection systems, and what more we can do?
So first of all European member states do have a minimum income scheme, and they look quite different. But one of the two themes that emerged from the discussion that we had is that more and more often, because of patchy employment histories, those that should be liable to social insurance schemes such as unemployment protection, then they fall back on poverty schemes such as minimum income schemes, that are cash transfer schemes for those that are most in need. And the other aspect that emerged, more related to the crisis and now to the war, is with the rising inflation, minimum income schemes should be indexed in a way that it would be similar now with a minimum wage directive, so a periodical indexation of these cash transfer schemes.
Thank you very much. And for you, was there a clear priority, a clear next step that we need to take? Would it be, because of the cost of living crisis, that link with inflation? Is that the central and most urgent thing we need to do?
Well, first of all, and I think this emerged very clearly when we spoke about the European dimension, is that the European Union should do more with regards to poverty and social exclusion. So there will be a forthcoming recommendation coming out this fall. But the general consensus among the panel was that this is, of course, welcome, but it should be an opening window for then a directive coming up in the years to come. Although there might be low political will to have this happen, but this was definitely mentioned.
So some doubts that it will happen, that member states would sign up to the EU, because of course that old argument about the EU's competences in this area comes back at time and time again.
Particularly because, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No, please.
And particularly because there is unanimity at the council, so there will be some member states with some reticence towards these types of schemes.
So big challenges ahead. But as you said, this is one of those areas where the goal is absolutely clear. We know what it is we need to do. The debate about the extent to which there is the will to do it remains. Thank you so much for that. We're now coming on to panel 13, democratizing the workplace to redress power inequality. Delighted to welcome Marcus Meyer, senior researcher here. And Marcus, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is really a theme running through our discussions very strongly yesterday, but you were focusing on some alternative ways that workers are involved, not just you were looking at the trade union role, but also other ways, I believe. What was the focus of your discussion, and did a clear vision emerge of what we're trying to do here?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Indeed, looking at non-traditional forms, but also very much looking at what we are having as traditional forms. And I will get to that in a second. So indeed, we're looking at democratizing firms. And one key takeaway, we had 4 excellent speakers, and I can't summarize everything. So I encourage you to read their publications, because it's a lot more nuanced than what I can convey in 2 minutes. That workplace voice matters also for political voice. So if you are having democracy at work, that and even negative experiences. So if you're trying to voice your concerns as an employee in a company, that even negative experiences of suppression of your voice is teaching you how to express it in different ways, and therefore teaching you also how to transfer these experiences and this knowledge also to the political sphere. So it's not just democracy at work, but it's also spilling over into political democracy. So it's very central also to the other themes that we are discussing in these 3 days. And the firm can be seen, therefore, also as a political entity, as Professor Ferreiras coined this quite aptly. And therefore, we should give more rights, indeed, than we currently have to employees, and especially also to have labor representatives as counterbalance to capital. To capital's voice, and therefore have bicameralism in companies. So indeed, having more unique ways of addressing this inequality that is inherent to the current corporate structuring, and then the firm as a whole. And we saw indeed worker buyouts as one form of addressing this. And especially this economic bicameralism and the emancipation of workers as 2 strains that really emerged from this panel, as avenues to address the current inherent inequality that we also heard yesterday, that we have inequality, we have a democracy gap. So I will leave it at that for now. And
just to follow up on that for a moment, in terms of, as you say, you're talking beyond the more traditional frames of the trade union agenda, talking about buyouts and so on. But you also, I think, did look at the role and opportunities for trade unions in this area. Did anything particularly striking that I should be putting to our panel tomorrow on the role of trade unions come out of that part of the discussion?
Absolutely. So I left that because I hoped that you would open the avenue for me to jump in. That indeed the linchpin, the linking element is collective bargaining, collective action, because you need to have some form of power in order to get backing to this change, that this transition from the current status quo to the more democratic situation in companies and then society as a whole. And trade unions through, for instance, this workplace voice that I mentioned, that needs training. So there is a role for trade unions and also for trainers. That's one. Secondly, the solidarity, and to address also inequality that is inherent to the different positions of employees. That is something that very much is already starting to be taken up by trade unions. I think we would all agree that more can be done. And job security matters, and also here the struggle for fixed term contracts, for more stable, not only fixed term contracts but also more stable, secure jobs for employees are key elements as a basis, so that employees can voice their voices. Because Agnes Ackermann, she did a huge study for 6 years, I believe. If you don't have job security, you're not speaking up. So therefore, it's crucial that we have more security there. And therefore, trade unions and collective bargaining, as Stan has discussed and has also coined it very, very aptly, there's certainly a key role for trade unions.
Thank you very much indeed. And for you, did you identify out of that, was there one thing that struck you above all else that needs to be done?
Yeah, there was a clear consensus that we're not there yet. I think that's also clear from my brief summary. A first positive note that was mentioned from the panelists is that EU legislation is crucially needed, and the Democracy at Work resolution of the European Parliament of December last year was a first good step in the right direction. But a lot needs to be done because we also have huge differences between countries. You have countries with high level of, for instance, co-determination, if you take the German example, but you have other countries where there is no such employee co-determination mechanism in place. So there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you very much indeed, Marcus. Let us move to panel 14, work-related psychosocial risks and health inequality, how to prevent suffering that comes with a price tag. And for this one, Paula Franklin, a senior researcher at the ETUI, is going to tell us a little bit about what was discussed. So in this area, was the answer to what would an equal society look like clear? Was the goal absolutely clear and the discussion was around the levers? Or was there some debate also in terms of the goal?
Thank you, Jackie. The answer was clear, but I'll give you a bit of context just to put the psychosocial risks in their place. So first, it was clear in the panel that work-related psychosocial risks are unfair. They create inequalities in terms of access to your rights and also health inequalities. But the key here is that they're also preventable. Secondly, we learned that they're very costly to workers, their families, they are costly to employers and the public healthcare systems. A price tag of 11.4 billion per year were put on just one illness and limited number of exposures. So this is a tip of an inequality iceberg that we are looking at in terms of psychosocial risks. Now, for the ideal world, the world where we want to be is, of course, equal protection against these risks of all workers, regardless of your workplace or the type of your employment contract. So this is the easy answer. There was a consensus that young people are at a very vulnerable situation in the labor market in terms of psychosocial risks. So there were statistics, there was research related to this, and therefore we need to focus on their working environment and employment conditions. And it was also told that protection, like the occupational health and safety protection of young people, is lacking. So we really need to look into that. No, we can't hear. Sorry.
Sorry, had a momentary technical issue there. Inevitable that would happen. In terms of those policy levers and what we need to do, both the policies, the processes, and the actors involved, did you identify some very clear and important ones?
Well, the panel highlighted the importance of moving from prioritization of the economic growth and GDP towards emphasis on impacts on health and well-being as a key outcome for economic policies. We've actually heard that already before yesterday, so I think that's a very clear message. They used the phrasing even to make the economy accountable for the well-being of people. And an example was given how large corporations have had huge impacts on the regulatory environment at the EU level, and through that on the key drivers of working conditions. So this was a clear message there. And also it was said that we know what the problems are. Okay, and we know a lot about psychosocial risks, work-related psychosocial risks, and now we actually need to prevent them. So this is something we have the knowledge, and we need to move forward to the action.
So absolutely, we know, going back to my first question, we absolutely know what we have to do. We have to do it. In terms of a key next step, was there something clear that emerged for you from the discussion?
I think in terms of it was related to the momentum that we've had with the COVID, for example, psychosocial risks of telework, of the frontline workers, these kind of issues, and the crucial role of trade unions in these areas. It was really said, especially at the EU level, related also to the regulation of the many issues we talked about, platform work. That is often very rife with psychosocial risks. So this was for the EU level trade unions. It was a it was highlighted as a very important sphere.
Thank you so much for that, Paula. And our last panel, panel 15, a very hot topic right now because of the war in Ukraine, the reception and integration of refugees, lessons learned for the Ukraine crisis. So I know you were looking back, Zena Raznacha, senior researcher at the ETUI, you were looking back at the lessons we can learn from previous refugee crises, but also then looking forward in terms of what can be done differently this time. Of course, we are now well into that crisis. So what is being done and what can be done? What was the focus of your discussions? Where did you put your emphasis?
I mean, we discussed a number of things. We discussed sort of lessons learned not to do, indeed, from the previous response to previous refugee crisis. And we had an excellent contribution on Syrian integration in Turkey. And then we also tried to start learning from the current influx from Ukrainian refugees. And we also discussed already the first wave of Ukrainian refugees from the time of occupation of Crimea as well. So there actually some lessons can be learned already from with regard specifically to Ukrainian refugees. So we discussed that, and there is plenty of those. So I'm interested in what exactly do you want to hear?
When you say lessons in what not to do, what would you highlight as the most important lesson of what we shouldn't do? And then one lesson of what we should do?
Yeah, so basically, and this is something listening to all the presentations which came across, and also in the sort of a larger context of migration policy. Migration policy sometimes is, or often is, institutionalized discrimination, and this is not, and this is also the case for refugee integration. And I guess the lessons not to do is not to treat refugees as commodity, first of all. Then also give them equality, but not only give them opportunity and equality, but not only formal equality, but substantive equality. And we discussed quite a lot when it comes to the labor market integration. We discussed this sort of ideas around rapid or versus sustainable integration in the labor market. So labor market integration maybe not always has to be rapid, but it has to be probably ideally sustainable in a longer term. And also we discussed what not to do is probably not to have zero active integration policies at the country level. What have to do is probably to foresee challenges when it comes to various aspects of integration, housing, education, etc., language, and then have rapid action in order to promote integration, in order to avoid long-term negative consequences and tensions, also including on the labor market.
And did you also discuss the risk of exploitation of those entering the labor market, particularly, as you say, in that rapid way? Were there any concrete steps that were identified to do this?
Yes, I think this is the issue. So, I mean, there is a big gender perspective, for example, to the current refugee wave. So it makes them even more vulnerable to exploitation, and also there are a lot of sort of a negative experiences with the previous refugee waves and their exploitation and trafficking. And this is indeed the sort of a rapid versus sustainable integration agenda, where we actually need to think, okay, giving blatant access to the labor market is probably not enough. We need to see the specific needs of refugees as entrants to the labor market. So we need to have additional policies. And it's also, it's, you know, labor market is only one aspect. You have housing, you have links with communities, you have so many other aspects to think about. And it is a complex problem where no simple solutions exist, but there is a multitude of things one could do.
Thank you, Zain. Before I ask you whether you saw a clear priority, I just want to come back on what you said about when we're talking about equality, not just formal equality, but substantive equality. What does that equality look like, going back to our central question we're discussing throughout these 3 days?
Yeah, so it basically means that we do not have only formal principle of equality where we just give the same rights to refugees as the local population, but we also look at their particular needs. So we make sure that they have the childcare, we make sure that they have access to education, we make sure that and we make sure that they have assistance in access to all these social services. And also the sort of a special emphasis on language, but also I guess to the sort of a being culturally aware and being actually able to fine-tune these policies in cooperation with representatives from these refugee communities in order to find actual sustainable solutions in long term. That would be some steps going towards this sort of more substantive equality.
And for you, was there a clear next step?
Okay, so there was one interesting, I think, outcome which we discussed, also sort of looking backwards a little bit of what has happened and this sort of very different political response to the current refugee crisis. One aspect which came across in the discussions was, well, first, we cannot, you know, there are other refugees as well, so we need to expand maybe this policy response to other groups of refugees, maybe even looking backwards. And this would be probably the key aspect. And then we cannot we need to learn from this. Is a bit of a testing ground, I guess, this new political response. Yeah. So then we will test how this works, and then hopefully looking forward, we can, this could be the standard response, you know, to refugee crisis. And I think that's something which came across quite clearly in the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Zaina, and thank you to you all for again doing a brilliant job in summarizing such rich discussions. And may I, on behalf of us all, also add thanks to all the speakers in those sessions. But let me turn now, if I could, to Nicola Kontouris, because Nicola, we are coming to the end now of the research part of this event. We are moving to the public part, and I just wanted to hear your reflections a bit on the link between the two. So first of all, before we talk about what questions this raises for the public part, listening to the summaries today and yesterday, and I'm sure you've been dipping in and out of those panels, what were the most striking points that came out for you? What struck you in particular about? It's a difficult one, I know, but were there things that really jumped out at you?
Thank you, Jackie. Striking points. Well, I think some of the striking points are not so striking in the sense that some of the hypotheses that we elaborated when preparing the conference, I think, have been confirmed by the work and the contributions made in the panel. So, for instance, as expected, think we're all in agreement that the inequality problem is a multidimensional problem. There are strong interlinkages between these different dimensions, and therefore solutions require a joined up process of elaboration. To make an example, it's clear that prohibited discrimination on grounds of sex in pay processes and wage setting processes, it's been successful, but up to a point. We've probably encountered a ceiling. If we want to address the remaining gender pay gap, we need to think beyond pay discrimination in the workplace. And I think this is really something that has come up from some of the panels that were looking at paid, unpaid work, care work, roles, and so on and so forth. And in a way, this has also reinforced, and it has come up nicely in the last part of the conversation just now. It has reinforced the view that we need to move towards more ambitious models of equality. We have to move beyond the idea of formal equality and move on to other forms of equality of outcome.
So is that
have a
becoming so?
transformative effect.
Your central question that you gave us at the beginning of this about that imagining, that defining of a more equal society, which you said hasn't been talked about a lot. We all say yes, equality good, but we don't necessarily say what do we mean by it. Is the answer to that becoming clearer, do you think, from these discussions? What does that ambitious equality look like? Yes, but.
So yes, but because in a way these are the hypotheses that have been even reinforced in many ways. But it's also clear that through this debate, a number of new dimensions have emerged that are probably not part of the bread and butter of egalitarian thinking. And I think we probably need to devote a bit more attention to these dimensions that we've done so far. At least I have to. I mean, it's clear that other people already have.
What sort of areas are you talking about?
I'll give an yes, I was struck in particular, for instance, by the role that the ECB's monetary policy can have on increasing, potentially reducing inequalities, the role of stock exchanges in augmenting, reducing the question of inequality. I think we talk a lot about climate change and its effect on inequality, but it's quite clear to me that we're not talking enough. And we're talking a lot about it from a European perspective, but clearly when you expand the analytical lens to the whole world, and if there is a global problem, that's a problem of global change, all of a sudden you're really struck by the magnitude of the problem, and we clearly need to devote more attention to that. I mean, if the integration of Ukrainian refugees is something that requires a lot of effort, attention, and resources in terms of making sure that inequalities do not increase and are not disproportionately affected, imagine how many resources would be necessary in order to deal with climate migration influxes and refugee influxes in the future. So there are some topics, some dimensions of the problem. I mean, if anything, the problem is even more complex than we thought. I think that's probably. And the other, we talk about inequality in the traditional sense, but I've seen the reemergence of areas such as poverty, social exclusion, that sometimes egalitarians are not particularly comfortable with. We think that a lot of egalitarians think that even if you eliminate poverty, absolute poverty, you can still have a problem with inequality, and that's why it's better to address directly the problem of inequality as opposed to the problem of poverty, which is actually very hard to address. I think Tony Blair, for instance, tried very much to eliminate the problem of poverty, didn't quite succeed, and in the meantime inequalities were increasing. So and there are several other, but it's clear that poverty is a concern. It's clear that insecurity of status, insecurity of income, insecurity of working conditions, exposure to risk, societal risk, is a big concern as well, and probably egalitarians need to think about that too in imagining a more equal society.
Okay, so the question has become, as you say, even more complex, even more difficult to find those answers. But as we move now from the research part of this event to the public event, what questions have those panels of our discussion so far raised that you think really need to be in focus in the discussions this afternoon and tomorrow?
Well, obviously, redistributive questions around income, wealth are likely to be the core. But one thing that really struck me, and it's coming up almost in every panel, and in some panels more expressly than in other panels, is that there's a big question about redistribution of power. And I think this is probably that also requires more attention in the overall debate about a more equal society than certainly I have up until now. So linked to that, of course, is the role of trade unions in redistributing power. Yesterday, we started the conversation by saying that, of course, unions play a central role in redistribution processes within the labor market. And of course, that's a very important place to look for fair redistributive mechanisms, because that's where wealth is created. But actually, in the conversation, it became quite clear that we also need to look about power redistribution, not just in the labor market and in work relations, but also in the economy and in society at large. And I think that is interesting because, of course, trade unions traditionally have been present and strong in regulating labor markets. Historically, they have occasionally done more than that, but it's clear that their core business has been labor market regulation. So, there's a big question about, the future role of trade unions. Do they just represent members? Should we represent interests beyond membership? As some unions already do, especially in a political context in which often parties do not represent those interests explicitly. So a number of, I think, challenging questions in terms of power redistribution beyond the labor market for the actors that we're particularly interested in here. Do we want to share this redistribution of power with other actors? I think that's going to be an important part of the conversation: power redistribution and the role of unions in redistributing power beyond labor markets.
Something I promised to take up when I'm moderating that panel on what trade unions can do. Nicola, you've said if one thing has emerged from this so far, it is an awareness that it's even more complex than we hoped. So when we look to the outcomes of this conference, this is really, you indicated yesterday, the beginning of a conversation. Where do you hope to get to by the end of our discussions tomorrow? What are your hopes for this event?
Of course, 10 bullet points in terms of how to make societies more equal as of Monday. But this is not. It's a bit of an optimistic scenario. I think having a clearer picture of what a more equal society will look like is clearly the goal. I think we started the conversation with having a clearer picture of what an equal society will look like. But it's becoming, I think it's apparent to me, I don't know about the other people, that we're no longer talking about an equal society, we're talking about a more equal society. It's interesting because a lot of the discussions that we've had have been about democracy, about freedom in a very deep sense, the idea that, you hold on to your characteristics, but you get rid, or society gets rid of the disadvantages and the detriments that are traditionally associated to those characteristics, especially through market exchanges. We've spoken about universalism. We've spoken about guaranteeing certain basic goods, public goods, at a universal level. There's been a discussion, but we have not challenged the role of markets in allocating certain dimensions of value to certain goods, services, work, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about, I think the discussion is revolving around the idea of a more equal society with regulated markets, but where democracy and freedom are really the driving forces behind all of that. So
okay, so just a small agenda for us over the next 24 hours. Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you again to the rapporteurs, both today and yesterday, and a big thanks to all the speakers in those parallel sessions. It's been a very rich and very enlightening discussion, and lots, as we just heard from Nicola, to take into the public part of this conference, which will start at 2 o'clock this afternoon with an opening plenary on rising inequalities in a changing world. And then in the second plenary, we're going to hear a keynote by Thomas Piketty. We're talking about what policies to reduce inequalities. Tomorrow, we're going to have panels on climate change. We're going to look more at that blueprint. What does the blueprint look like? And as I've mentioned several times, a final panel on what trade unions can do. So lots to discuss. Thank you very much to you all. It's now time for lunch, so take a break, and at 2 o'clock sharp, the public part of the conference will begin. Thank you all very much for now, and see you later on. Will you join me in thanking our speakers very much?
thank you.